A very warm welcome from my side.
Thank you.
I will talk today to Joseph Joder, a very widely appreciated software engineer as far as I learned from my research on the internet. And we want today talk about how a good system design looks like and what's the things that an architect has to look at to build good service-based systems. So, Joe, introduce yourself.
My name's Joe Yoder. Uh, I'm probably best known for being one of the co-authors on the most successful architecture deployed to date, called the Big Ball of Mud architecture. And me and my colleague Brian Foote, when we wrote that, it was not meant to say build big balls of mud. It was rather to talk about this architecture happens. There's good reasons why it happens. Maybe if we acknowledge that and talk about it, we can keep them from getting out of control. And sometimes there's a good reason for either doing something quick or dirty, or an organization goes along, they're building the right architecture, maybe a monolith, and it was the right architecture for the time, but as the business needs changes and things really start scaling up or evolving, your organizational changes due to a lot of things, that can have quite an issue on that monolith architecture. And if that architecture doesn't adapt and change, it can really start slowing you down and causing some effects. And it can become very entangled and muddy with a lot of technical debt. And I've I've been I was actually fortunate enough to be with uh, one of the Gang of Four members when I was doing my graduate work back in the early '90s,
Mhm.
Ralph Johnson. And so I'm a big patterns guy. I've written a lot of patterns. In fact, writing a book right now on cloud application architecture patterns for designing, building, and modernizing for the cloud. And I've was also with the group that coined and invented the term refactoring with the first commercial refactoring tools. And so in the during the dot-com boom of the '90s, uh, accidentally people started, hey, can you come and help us do this? Or a lot of consulting opportunities were available. So we started kind of this umbrella company called the Refactory, where a lot of the principles of the Refactory, Ralph Johnson, the Gang of Four person, Don Roberts and John Brandt, who wrote the first commercial
Oh,
refactoring tools, and Brian Foote and myself. And I've been doing by accident this type of work for a lot of large and small and medium-sized companies, including some startups, sometimes not so successful, but sometimes some that are. So I've been in the industry for a long time, practicing, and I'm passionate about trying to help and work with building successful systems.
for the architects, it's very interesting to know now what do you have to do to build better cloud systems.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels to me that we lost a little bit track with all these things around Kubernetes and something like that to really focus again more on the software, which is and learn and give the people also some guardrails how to build good systems. So, what do you think is the key part of a well designed, also well chunked? Maybe I try to avoid the usual terms like microservice or
Right.
monoliths. Or well chunked system, and what are the things you have to the top principles you have to stick to.
Um, and by the way, that's an excellent kind of thought process you're going through, because one of the things I believe is the principles have not changed. A lot of the foundation principles are the same, even a lot of things that we were trying to promote in the '90s with good object oriented design, how to model around the domain. Long before Eric Evans even did his domain driven design book, there was the concept of trying to do a good, build how to build reusable systems and how to build good interfaces, and and how to build separation of concerns, whether you have a layered architecture or other types of things. So a lot of those principles it's almost like Back to the Future. We forgot some of them, and I was almost hearing that when I was hearing you talk. But all those principles are kind of coming alive again, a lot that were even discussed in the 90s. And building a distributed architecture is very difficult, and that's not a silver bullet. But any architecture, you need to think about separations of concerns. A modular monolith is a very reasonable solution. And a monolith is not an anti-pattern. In fact, Chris Richardson, who wrote, the Microservices book, that's one of the first things he comes out. Should you build a monolith or microservices? A distributed architecture or distributed system, microservices is very challenging and difficult.
I fully agree with you that it depends on the complexity of the problem that you have and the business problem that you have to solve, what the suitable piece of complexity is that you have to build.
That's true, but maybe you don't even have to distribute them. They could be modules with separations, things around. But it could be that it makes sense to distribute them. And then you got, in addition to the challenges you were pointing out, you have things like possible distributed data between all these types of things, in addition to the locking issues or trying to debug what's going on. Are there runtime dependencies? Do we have the right granularity? And software design is always about architecture, especially is about trade-offs. It's not like there's a silver bullet. People got real excited about microservices, in 2014 and 15 when people really started talking about it, especially when it was being promoted by people like Martin Fowler and James Lewis. They had written about it. However, you see some companies they've gone that direction, but now they've had a lot of problems with it. So now they're pulling back. Even sometimes they're going back to, well, wait, a well-designed monolith works just as well. So in our book, we have a chapter on application architecture, and we say that if you squint at a high level, you can really see three types of architectures. One is the big ball of mud. So, and sometimes it makes sense. You're doing something quick and dirty. And a lot of successful systems have a little bit of muddiness. And so you're experimenting, you try a new idea, and there might be some entanglement. Now, if it takes off and you're having certain success with it, you better kind of adapt your practices, because then it can become technical debt. So you might want to modularize it. So a modular monolith is a second type of architecture. And then, of course, then you might say, oh, I want to scale up part of the system, or do other things with it. There might be performance issues or other things. So then we can distribute that module. So that's still a modular, a distributed architecture is one way of doing modular, but now we have a way of distributing it. But then, just to talk about the trade-off, there's a lot. Building a distributed architecture has some benefits, especially with teams working independently and pushing it out with DevOps or whatever. On the other hand, building a distributed architecture is very hard. And so but depending on your business needs, it can have a big win if you build it right.
You told me that you have some principles to build better services and service interfaces. So let's talk about
the ideals, the guiding ideals for designing microservices.
Right.
Okay. Well, let me just tell you where they came from, if you don't mind. At the end of 2018, I was doing a lot of work collaborating with for a company in Brazil. Their equivalent of PayPal and Square in Brazil, and then they were growing very rapidly and taking on. They went from 20 some teams to, like, by 2020 to a few hundred teams. Let alone their business was more than quadrupling every 6 months or so. A good problem to have, but definitely very challenging. And with that, and so as they were going, the monolith and the way they were even doing some of their agile practices had to adapt for this. They had a ball of mud and how to refactor it and let's get a better design. But it's like, well, I can help refactor it, and we have a lot of good tooling to help clean it up. But if you don't change the way you're doing things, in a year you'll be back to the same place with the same architecture. And so you even need to rethink it. I worked with a colleague of mine, Paulo Merson from Brazil, and brought him in with my company, The Refactory, and we were teaching what makes good microservice design. and also what makes good design in general, and how to do clean code and refactor, and you know, especially as they were constantly growing. And at that same time, the SEI in the U.S., the Software Engineering Institute, they had a conference coming up called Saturn. It's a big software architecture conference. And I said, Paulo, we should give like this cool little talk, some kind of quick talk at Saturn. And I said, I'm not sure what we want to talk about, but Paulo says, well, I have some ideas. When he's teaching microservices a lot, quite often he gets asked, well, you know, you have solid principles, which are good design principles, specifically focused more around object-oriented. Do they apply to microservices or not? And so he, you know, he'd been thinking about it, and he said, let's try to put together something. And he had these originally he called IDEALS. The IDEALS, he wanted to, we wanted to make sure it made up a cool acronym too. So we were having fun with it. That do that, and so we kind of evolved that, and we used my customer as a way to experiment with these ideas. And the idea started out with, for designing microservices, is interface segregation of your microservices is still very important, just like the solid.
But you have to implement it and think it differently if you're talking about service interface.
Right. So rather than your object interface, you're thinking from your service. But once again, it's very similar when we did it. But definitely something that becomes even more critical in microservices. I mean, it's still critical with regular monolithic architectures, but deployability, DevOps, and how you put things out. So that's what the D is. What was with the ideas. And then he had looked at event-driven for the E, and availability for the A, and then he had S for single responsibility. And he had presented some of these ideas, and him and I worked on them together, and we evolved it to a beginning of a talk. But one thing that was pointed out is that maybe we were lacking something in our ideas, because I was testing out the ideas with different people whenever I talked to them, especially at conferences, in the hallways and during the breaks, like when we were talking earlier today during the break. And it was pointed out that, how about coupling? Coupling is always important in general, but it even becomes more critical when you're building a distributed architecture. Is there a lot of coupling with that? So that's where we evolved the ideas to IDEALS, and adding in the low coupling. Coupling is always important, but it even becomes more critical, because if you have a lot of entangled microservices, there's nothing worse than having a distributed big ball of mud, or a big distributed ball of mud. And so if there's a lot of runtime coupling, that's even a worse problem and harder to do. I would rather have a ball of mud in a monolith than having a distributed ball of mud.
I think that it's very important to understand that the terms are maybe the same, but let's say the sphere where you have to use it is a little bit different.
Yeah, some terms are the same. One thing that you never really saw in Solid was event-driven. However, I will say this for Solid, they have one principle that I haven't figured a way to get the acronym in quite yet, the O, open, and that's by Berkshire Meyer, where you have open for extension, but closed for modification.
Yeah.
So wouldn't it be cool if you can add a new feature by just writing some kind of new service or new class without changing any existing code? You know, you have confidence that you have not broken anything.
Yeah.
And so that principle is still somewhat relevant. And in fact, you kind of get it a little bit with event-driven, depending on, but you're still kind of, your dependency is still on the events, but it's not a direct dependency. And I don't even, if I'm a publisher of the event, I don't care who's subscribing to it. So you can add new behavior by just, but once again, you have to understand the knowledge is, what is this publishing? But the publisher doesn't care from that perspective.
But this is exactly what I thought also, that you don't mind who's additionally subscribing to get some additional functionality work, which means
you have to model around the domain to really help you apply a lot of these principles and find those separations of concerns, especially if you're going to microservices. But microservices have a lot of benefits if you have a lot of teams and a lot of changes, and teams can now work more autonomously. You can do very quick experiments by just building a couple new microservices and releasing them, especially if you can do it without affecting the rest of the system. On the other hand, you have to make sure that are there dependencies on these other microservices, and are there things with the distributed transactions? So you need to get that design right if you want to get the benefits with that. If you're not, if your organization isn't growing fast and you have just a few teams, maybe a monolith is still a good way to go.
Yeah. And on the other hand, if you see an organization like us with a landscape like hell, you can think about, I don't think that the option is really to build more monoliths. On the other hand, you still have to think about to do the right thing in the right situation.
Well, and even with yours, and so I would even be curious with your, because you're right, when you have a big organ and when the organization really kind of takes off and becomes this, I don't want to use the word beast, but something really kind of big. It's hard to even kind of get your arms around it. No single individual can, because there's so many different types of systems and subsystems. But your individual system, maybe those are kind of monolithic, but they're still kind of distributed out there somewhere, somehow. But they're not done as small, independent microservices. But maybe there's some kind of wrapper around that application or something.
And even if you look closer to it, you find out that our landscape is something like, let's say, a chain of monoliths. It's not anymore a monolith, but it's we have so-called order chains, which are chains of monoliths.
Yeah, I like that. That's what I was trying to get to.
Which is not bad in the end, because it's even further, because we had to learn early how to handle distributed system.
In our book, we have a couple chapters on modernization and also design. So one thing we have, strangling the monolith. So if you have a monolith and it was successful to a point, but now because of your change and growing, how can we evolve it? And maybe we want to modernize it. So we go through a lot of patterns, and some of that might start with wrapping to protect the monolith from change. And then maybe we're adding new features or things outside the monolith. But then you may have some things inside the monolith. Sometimes you might bring out a macro service and then refactor it to microservices.
I think we put a lot of thoughts to the people outside, so to not overload them. I could talk for hours with you about that one, and we come from one to the other.
Right.
So maybe we have a chance to do it once again at some times later.
Sure.
It would be really appreciated. On the other hand, I want to give them, the people in our show notes, all the references you had to your books and also to the IDEALS thingy. And do you want to close, give a very crisp, let's say, last word to our engineers and architects? What would you think they should really, let's say, put on the top of their agenda for the next, or in general, to build good systems?
Well, first of all, I always like to say design is always about trade-offs, and there are no silver bullets. And you should think about whether I'm building a monolith or microservices. It's not like one is superior to the other. It's think about the types of things that you're doing. And the most important thing, that if I was to tell a young Joe again a long time ago, is think about the domain I'm modeling, and modeling around the domain and find those separation of concerns.
Joe, a very round picture, and I think a lot of brain food for our architects.
Yes.
Thank you a lot.
Oh.